I'm really excited to have my guest, Frances Valintine, an innovator, emerging technologies, futurist, disruptor of traditional education with me today. Frances is based in New Zealand and is the founder of Tech Futures Lab, which she started in 2016 with the purpose of really fostering the capabilities and skills needed to develop a culture of innovation and agility, critical to both companies and businesses and individuals. And prior to this, in 2013, she founded the Mind Lab to empower students to develop applied digital knowledge and capability. And since that time, she and her team have been instrumental in reskilling and educating 20,000 adult students and educating many thousands of others in short technology courses and over 250,000 school-aged children. Just a remarkable accomplishment and feat. So really, really honored to have you with us, Frances. Welcome, and thanks for making time.
Thank you, Vince. It's so great to be here.
So first question, in light of, as an education futurist, how has the global pandemic influenced your thinking about how leaders themselves need to think about the future of their organizations?
I think the first thing is that people realize that their future is looking very different. And so people are having to think about learning as though their future now depends on what they know. When you have a circuit breaker of the extent that COVID had, that people start understanding that things can shift very quickly, and if you are caught in traditional ways of thinking or operating or mindsets that haven't really transitioned, then actually you're quite vulnerable. And so I think people have had that real moment of clarity where they've said, do I have the right knowledge and skill set for the future, particularly if I've got decades ahead of me? And that's really coming to play right now.
So if I'm sitting there and I'm looking ahead over the next 10 or 20 years, what's your sense of how should I be thinking about my career as a leader at this moment in time?
At the moment, I think if you look across the decision-making tables, whether that be in the executive team or whether it be a board of directors, there is often a lot of great legacy, a lot of great experience, but often they are individuals sort of operating or cooperating together and not necessarily collaborating. I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between those two operating modes. And so if I use the analogy, if I have what we call a potluck dinner, I assume it translates, a shared dinner with friends, and you tell everybody to bring a dish to share, people will bring the dish that they most love, because they know that people love it, they know it really well. So they do the thing they know the best. They bring it along, everybody puts that food on the table and you share it. But there's been no learning, there's been no ability to do things together. In collaboration, you would say everybody brings some food ingredients along, we'll put them on the table, we'll see what we have, and we'll find some recipes that none of us know, but we'll find things that we can create and make. And then we will make the food together. We will have a huge learning journey in the process, and in the end we get to benefit from the shared meal. And so one of the things that we really focus on when we look at individuals is saying, are you collaborating? Or are you operating as though the information that you have is good enough to keep you at the decision-making table? How do we get people mixing and mingling and learning amongst people who are not like them? So they're not operating in the same bubble and they're not overly indexed by the same constant conversations. Because then you get to the point where you really do believe your own hype or your own story, to the point where no one is challenging because there is the collective thinking. And so part of it is learning new skills, and part of it's understanding how to bring divergent skills and thoughts together into one collective process.
There's a lot of talk about collaboration. It's not always easy to do. I think you're right. I think there's a lot of cooperation. Sometimes people cooperate, but not fully. What do I need to say and do just to get past this meeting? But that idea of that collaboration and its connection to diversity of thinking and really challenging ourselves becomes really, really important, and it's a really helpful analogy to help leaders understand that. What do you see in your work as some of the other capabilities that leaders are going to need over the next 3 to 5 years to be successful?
I think the key one is we now know that the population demographics have shifted so significantly. We have a third of the world population who are young,
Yeah.
and they have only ever known technology. So they talk in a language of technology that is, they can talk about artificial intelligence like it's a toaster. It's
Hmm.
almost it's seamless, it's an integration, it's a tool of their time and their generation. And so at the other extreme, we have an aging population who we want to ensure are still engaged. But if you're in business, you have to look at who your customer is and really understand more than just the technologies that are shifting. It's all very well to say, I'm learning how to use the insights of data better, or I'm trying to get my head around machine learning or the Internet of Things. But actually, more importantly, is why are you learning that? Because in the end, you're looking at your customer base, regardless of what service or product you sell, and your demographics will be having quite different expectations. Humanity is going through a really big transition right now in terms of how it thinks about the future. And of course, we're almost at the front end. We're thinking about space and beyond and
Yeah.
conquering, sort of colonizing new planets on the far extreme. And on the other hand, we're trying to get back to the basics of, good food on the table and thinking about taking away some of the industrial kind of attitudes and behaviors that we've developed over the last few years or decades.
What's hype? What's real? What's your experience telling you?
So I'm a really big believer that when you're looking across markets, and you can take a global view quite easily now, even from a lockdown world, that
Yeah.
there are always early signals of change. And so some of them will be, for example, I've been watching energy for a long time, saying how do people think about energy and which countries are really leaping forward in their adoption of renewables and electric cars, and actually what is driving that change versus a country where those settings are quite different, where there is very slow adoption. Is it affordability? Is it a communication? Is it storytelling? Is it a lack of evidence? And so when you are looking across a learning community, and I always think of everybody as a learning community, think about what is making them think differently and
Hmm.
why are they acting or thinking differently? What are those triggers? How much of that is influenced by government versus it is a grassroots uplifting of change? And then we look across and saying which technologies feel like they've been supercharged ahead, even against necessarily the investment that's going into them. So we're seeing this sort of convergence across these technologies, but again, they always come from a signal, and we start to see behavioural change. And I think youth for me are the most interesting. I had this concept around 12-year-olds that a 12-year-old their brain is formed well and truly enough to have really strong opinions, and they've seen enough of the world to kind of figure out where they fit in, but they are not influenced as much by their peer groups and their friends and teenage hormones. And so that they have this kind of clarity about what they imagine the world to be. And I feel like whenever I sit with those groups of young people around that age group, they have this very clear understanding of this sort of fluidness between technology and people and responsibility and fairness, which I think is really insightful about a generation that's coming. And I also think that we're starting to see the power strength, or what we call the bench strength of baby boomers and the old guard of decision makers,
Hmm.
who now are starting to feel a little more intimidated by this change because it's no longer just uncomfortable. Now it's really kind of dominant in terms of some of the conversations that are happening, and it's unfamiliar. Here in New Zealand, we talk about, strangely enough, we talk about sheep. A lot of people know New Zealand because of sheep. But when
Right.
you try to inside a paddock or a field with fences, if you have sheep in a corner, if you stand back, they kind of ignore you. But as you start to encroach onto their space, they start to react, and they start first of all looking with you in intrigue, and then they start to look a little bit concerned. And as you get closer again, they often will try to run at you. It's sort of a defence mechanism. And I sort of feel there is a little bit of that happening right now with some of the old guard who are feeling this encroaching shift and change that is coming, and they're not sure what to do with it. So the learning part of it is they either have to kind of get in and get conversations going with these groups of people to really understand, or they're going to have to defend their territory. And that's going to get increasingly difficult when the population and the demographics of the workforce are working against them.
What I'm seeing through the leadership lens is, that Generation Z or Z. I actually think they are the most sophisticated from a leadership perspective. I don't know if you've seen it with the young people you work with.
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. I actually have four of my own Gen Z children, and I actually am astounded by the clarity of their thinking and what they understand as leadership. What is
Yeah,
very different, though, is there is this adoption more of a servant leadership style
right.
where they do think of the community. There's a lot less focus on the individual. So individualism is almost seen as a negative,
Yeah,
and the strength of the collective is much more powerful. There is a real-time view of the world as it unfolds today through social media and media channels online. And so the understanding of what good and bad leadership looks like is much more front of mind. And
yes,
you can see it. And when it plays out, sort of traditional, even charismatic type leadership, if it plays out looking like it's for the benefits of a few, I think Generation Z are saying, for what purpose? And so
right.
I think, yeah, there's a lot more information they can see, and it's demonstrated all around them all of the time. And I think that's a critical difference between when I was growing up.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And from your perspective and the work you do, and we go back to kind of that reskilling. So we've got young people coming in with a lot of the right way of thinking, that kind of intuitive sense of the technologies, that stronger leadership. But there's other generations in the workplace, and what do companies really need to think about as they're looking to reskill? Because that's becoming such a strategic priority for many organizations.
So I think that one thing around COVID, which was really beneficial for learning, is it democratized education, and it meant that you didn't have to be in the same city as a great university to study. You didn't have to have deep pockets to be able to afford access to some of the best faculty in the world. So many of our best and brightest universities opened their doors figuratively to the virtual world. And whether there was a cost or not a cost, it was typically much more accessible. But I think it's now about saying everybody should be learning. And I always say it doesn't really matter what you're learning, because if you are in an environment where the topic is new to you, and it could be you're doing an art class, and you're normally a banker, I think it's this idea of saying an expectation that people should be one learning outside the job as well as inside the job, and actually and finding a ways and ability to carve off time in people's week, that the onus is not just about them taking time out of their downtime from work, but actually really helping facilitate this idea that neurons need to be fed and stimulated, like just in the same way that fitness, we need a certain level of fitness to be healthy. There's been a very significant study, it's just come out in the Australia-New Zealand region, which is the number one attribute of a good job today is companies supporting learning. The least important was food, which is really interesting. Companies that feed and deliver pizzas on Friday, that was the least important. The number one by quite a significant margin was companies that support learning, because I think that everybody does understand that what's carried them to the point they are today is not going to get them where they need to be going forward. And then in between, the only thing that really needs to happen is new ability to understand what's shifting, the knowledge to have that, the skills that you need to be successful. And so the companies need to be really identifying whether it be time or budgets or recognition that learning is personal. I'm not a great believer of saying you must study a particular program. That feels very much like the old school of industrial education, but more saying what would you want to study and what would that mean to you if you had a chance to do that study. And I know that everyone's probably heard the saying before is, what if I invest in a staff member and they leave, and then
Right.
the flip being, what if you don't invest and they stay? And that idea, if you're not investing in your staff and they're not learning new skills and don't have a new perspective, then actually from the day you hired them, it's been a negative return. You've
Yeah.
had no returns back from that person. You've already got the best from them from on the first day that they were employed. So
Yeah.
it is really important. And with a remote working workforce or a distributed workforce and people not coming to the office as much, there's going to have to be a huge level of trust that leaders are going to have around their staff. Because if they don't trust their staff, one, to do the work from home, they're going to feel even less comfortable with this idea that they're going to be paying or supporting them to study when they don't see them. And so trust is going to have to be something we get very comfortable with.
It is about trust, and I speak a lot about leadership accountability. It's pure accountability. It doesn't matter where the person is. Are they delivering the results? That should be the standard, and how they do it is up to them. But we seem to ultimately, I think it's exactly that. It's really testing leaders of, do you really trust your team?
Well, I think there's also another part of that when if you employ someone and they have to always be right, that's going to be a very difficult journey for everyone. Whereas if you hire someone who's open and willing to learn and to be wrong, or to be learning, or to say, I just don't know, or can we talk about this and see what people think? That's a very valuable employee because you know from the beginning that they're going to be constantly evolving and understanding and reflecting on what they know. In an era where trust, I think, is going to be probably the key word for the next, probably at least the next decade, as we try to filter out fake news from good news and good information from bad information. All those things are going to come back to how do we distinguish trust and reputation versus how do we distinguish what is just influencing, whether it be the technology or an algorithm that's influencing us in the wrong way. All of these things we're going to have to get underneath into the heart of this issue around trust and what it means to be having a trusted source or trusted staff and trusted leaders.
So I'm curious, right? As a futurist, as you look to the future, what excites you and inspires you the most? And then I'll ask you the flip side, what concerns you the most?
I love that we are becoming, the world generally is becoming a much better place. We have better health outcomes, better education outcomes. The world, there is a lot less people living in poverty. The middle class is rising. Access to education. Girls have almost equal levels of education today as males. We are seeing more equality and equity across the workforce and in salaries, and all of these are on a journey in the right direction. And even things like the metrics around teenage pregnancies or drug taking and various things, the media would have you think differently. They would have you think that this is all, everything's declining and getting worse. Actually, the reality is not. And actually, there's a wonderful website from a Swedish research organisation called Gapminder online, which gives all these facts about what the media would portray to be true and then the facts behind it. And it's really interesting to see how many people still believe that the world is a much scarier place than it was. Even in most places, crime is reducing, not everywhere. And so I think that part of that is more people have understanding and access to information. And we are sort of becoming more democratic, typically across the world. And more people are actually supporting others. And the shift towards the governments of the world, I think there's lots of good things happening. And a lot of it's off the basis of technology, because we now have information. We can now actually have access. It's not controlled. And there was a time when information was so controlled, and it was really for the nobility and the royalty and for the very top academics to have the types of information that we can expect. I'm an optimist, and I think the world is heading directionally in a better place. The flip side is like anything where there is money to be made and power to be gained, technology enables people to manipulate. And we've seen some of that with the likes of interference with in biases and artificial intelligence. We have new technologies emerging in the wrong hands. For example, CRISPR technology with gene editing. At the moment, there is sort of an unwritten rule of respect for not creating and playing with nature, but of course people will and have. There'll be people who, as we get into the era of quantum computing, and where we can start having access to some of the most incredible, complex computational processing in the world, the countries that have that first will have a dominance and a power over those who don't have access to that level of thinking and processing. And of course, recovery from COVID is going to be a very slow process for many economies. We're very fortunate here that we've bounced back, and in fact, we have the lowest unemployment we've had for a long time. I'm talking over years and years and years. We have a very buoyant economy, and so we have definitely come through COVID extraordinarily well as a country. But we all know that privilege. We're not at all under any illusion of what other countries very close to us are feeling right now. And so there is these two sides. Nothing is black and white anymore. And I think that for all the good, though, is still, to me, we have on the continuum. I'm on the good side of the glass half full,
Yeah.
and I think we're heading the right way.
And I think we have to be, right, because that's how we create the future. Where I get excited by is looking at young people coming into the workplace. And so, what words of wisdom would you have for them? Because they're going to be creating our future. They'll be trying to solve, some of these really challenges and problems that we've got to face. I'm curious, what are the words of wisdom you have for them?
When I was going in the early stage of my career, I had a generation of females before me who broke the glass ceiling, who actually were the first pioneers of female leaders, and they paved a way for me. And I'm incredibly thankful, because in some ways, myself and my peers, other female leaders, we got a lot of recognition for the work we were doing. They didn't. They were not. And I think about my own mother, was an incredible businesswoman, but didn't get the recognition because she was such an anomaly at the time. And I think now we have a generation who are coming through that do bring a really important perspective about where things are going, but the confidence to step up into organisations or step forward will still be challenged, because there is still a ceiling of hierarchy, and that we often talk about having young people represented at the board table or in the executive, but in reality that doesn't happen. People might bring them in as a guest. They might have a small collective of young people on a strategic day to plan around something around the future. And so for me, the messaging to Gen Z would be that, to say, be bold in that conviction of change, that actually, if you approach in a way where it's relatable and saying, I'm here to help, I'm not coming in to steal your job, I'm coming in to give my perspective, but keep working at that, because I think that it is hard. I mean, imposter syndrome is a very real feeling. It doesn't matter who you are. There are moments where you feel like you don't have the authority to actually lend your voice to the conversation. And I would say that this generation will suffer a little bit from that, because we haven't had a generation before of very young leaders. This is a new, we've always looked to an older generation to make those big decisions. And so I would just say to them, be strong in that conviction to step in, and wherever you can, take on every leadership opportunity you have to be heard, and find those open doors for people who will support you in that endeavour to keep going. And if you hit a closed door, people who are not open to that, go around the door. Don't use your energy fighting systems or people or organisations who are not listening. Go around and do it your way.
Frances, thank you so much for all your insights today. Really
Pleasure.
do appreciate you making time, and you're really sharing just some amazing points of view around the future, around learning and leadership. So thank you, and I wish you and your teams continued success in all your great work.
Thank you so much, Vince. Greatly appreciate it. It's great to be here.